Have you ever felt that God was saying no to something you desperately wanted? Maybe it was a job, a relationship, or a dream you poured your heart and soul into. It's easy to feel discouraged, even confused, when our desires don't align with God's plan. Today's Bible study is from the notes of former Mayor Ray Martinez, a man who understood the complexities of faith and leadership. Our scripture reading comes from 1 Chronicles chapter 28, verses 2 to 3. It was my desire to build a temple where the Ark of the Lord's covenant, God's footstool, could rest permanently. I made the necessary preparations for building it, but God said to me, "You must not build a temple to honor my name, for you are a warrior and have shed much blood." Through the stories of those who have walked before us, we'll discover that God's no is never a rejection, but a redirection towards something even greater. King David, a man after God's own heart, was a mighty warrior, a gifted musician, and a passionate leader. His life was marked by incredible victories and profound worship, making him one of the most revered figures in biblical history. He longed to build a magnificent temple for the Lord, a place where the Ark of the Covenant could rest and God's presence could dwell among his people. This temple was not just a building, it was to be a symbol of God's eternal covenant with Israel. David poured his heart into this desire, gathering resources, drawing up plans, and preparing to embark on this monumental task. He envisioned a grand structure that would stand as a testament to God's glory and faithfulness. But then God spoke. In a moment that shattered David's expectations, God said no. This divine intervention was unexpected and left David in a state of shock and contemplation. He explained to David that while his heart was in the right place, his past as a warrior disqualified him from building the temple. The battles he fought, the blood he shed, were not in alignment with the peaceful nature of the temple God envisioned. David had shed much blood in battle, and the temple, a place of peace and worship, was to be built by hands that had not been stained by war. This was a profound moment of realization for David. Imagine the disappointment David must have felt. His dreams, his plans all seemed to crumble in that divine moment. Yet this was not the end of his story. He had poured his heart and soul into this dream, and yet God said no. This was a test of David's faith and character. But David, being a man after God's own heart, understood that God's ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. He reflected deeply on this divine wisdom. He accepted God's decision, not with bitterness or resentment, but with trust and obedience. David's faith was unwavering, and he continued to worship and serve God with all his heart. God had a different plan, one that involved David's son, Solomon, a man known for his wisdom and peace. Solomon was chosen to fulfill the dream that David had started. David's story teaches us that sometimes God's no is not a rejection of our desires, but a redirection towards a greater purpose. David guided Solomon, imparting his wisdom and preparing him for the monumental task ahead. It's a reminder that God's plans are always better than our own, even when they don't make sense to us in the moment. David's legacy lived on through Solomon, and the temple became a symbol of God's enduring promise to his people. The Apostle Paul, a man who endured immense suffering for the sake of the gospel, experienced a thorn in the flesh, a constant source of pain and affliction. We don't know exactly what this thorn was, but it was something that caused Paul great distress. He pleaded with God 3 times to remove it, begging for relief from this agonizing burden. But God, in his infinite wisdom, said no. He told Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." God's response to Paul teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of his grace. Sometimes, God allows us to walk through seasons of suffering, not because he is punishing us or enjoys our pain, but because he knows that it is in our weakness that his strength is made perfect. Paul's thorn, whatever it may have been, became an opportunity for him to experience the sufficiency of God's grace in a way he never could have imagined. It was in his weakness that he discovered the depths of God's power and the unwavering nature of his love. Chapter 3. Moses, the great leader who led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, a man chosen by God to guide his people through some of the most miraculous events in biblical history, was denied entry into the Promised Land. After 40 long years of wandering in the harsh wilderness, enduring the scorching sun and the barren landscape, after facing countless obstacles and enduring the Israelites' grumbling and complaining, their doubts and fears, and their moments of rebellion, Moses stood on the cusp of the land he had longed to enter. But God, in a heartbreaking turn of events, said no. He reminded Moses of a past sin, a moment of disobedience that had far-reaching consequences. Moses pleaded with God, begging for mercy and a chance to enter the land he had spent his life pursuing, but God's decision was final. Moses would not enter the promised land. Imagine the pain and disappointment Moses must have felt. He had been faithful, he had led God's people, and yet he was denied the ultimate reward. But even in his disappointment, Moses remained obedient. He accepted God's judgment, trusting that even in the midst of unanswered prayers and unfulfilled desires, God was still good. Moses' story reminds us that God is holy and just, and sometimes our past mistakes have consequences that follow us, even when we have repented and experienced God's forgiveness. It's a sobering reminder that our actions have consequences, and that God takes sin seriously. Moses' journey, filled with both triumphs and trials, teaches us about the importance of faithfulness and obedience to God's commands. It shows us that while we may not always understand God's ways, we can trust in His wisdom and justice. Moses' legacy is not just about leading the Israelites to the brink of the promised land, but also about his unwavering faith and trust in God, even when faced with the most profound disappointments. Chapter 4. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane faced the weight of the world's sin. He knew what awaited him: the betrayal, the mockery, the excruciating pain of the cross. In that moment of agonizing anticipation, Jesus prayed to his Father, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Jesus, in his humanity, longed for another way. He asked if there was any other way to accomplish his Father's will, any other way to save humanity from their sins. But God's answer was no. The cup would not be taken from him. Jesus would have to endure the cross. In that moment of surrender, Jesus demonstrated the ultimate act of obedience. He chose his Father's will over his own desires, even when it meant facing unimaginable pain and suffering. Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane teaches us that sometimes God's no is an invitation to surrender our will to His. It's a reminder that His plans are always for our good and His glory, even when they lead us through valleys of suffering and pain. Chapter 5. The Israelites, after years of being led by judges, decided they wanted a king. They had been guided by wise and just leaders who were chosen by God, but they felt something was missing. They looked around at the other nations and thought, "We want to be like them." They saw the grandeur and power of the kingdoms around them and desired the same for themselves. "We want a king to rule over us, a king who can lead us into battle and bring us glory." They imagined a majestic figure who would bring them victory and honor. They approached the prophet Samuel, God's chosen spokesperson, and demanded a king. Samuel, who had faithfully served as their judge, was taken aback by their request. God, hearing their request, was grieved. He had always intended to be their king, guiding them with his wisdom and love. He told Samuel that the Israelites were not rejecting him, Samuel, but rejecting him, God, as their king. This was a profound moment of sorrow for both Samuel and God. He warned them that having a king would lead to oppression, to forced labor, and to the loss of their sons. The king would take their best fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his attendants. But the Israelites were insistent. They believed that a king would solve their problems and bring them the stability they craved. They refused to listen to God's warnings, blinded by their desire to be like the nations around them. Their hearts were set on having a king no matter the cost, so God, in His mercy, allowed them to have their way. He respected their free will, even though He knew the consequences would be dire. He chose Saul, a man who initially seemed like a good choice, but who ultimately proved to be a disaster as king. Saul's reign was marked by disobedience and failure. The Israelites' story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of rejecting God's best for us. Their desire for a king led them into a period of turmoil and regret. It's a reminder that sometimes in His love, God allows us to make our own choices, even when those choices lead us down paths of pain and regret. He hopes that through our experiences, we will learn to trust in His perfect plan for our lives. Outro. When God says no, it doesn't mean He's turned His back on us or that He doesn't care about our desires. It often means He loves us too much to give us less than His best. His no is a redirection, a gentle nudge towards a path that aligns with His perfect will for our lives. Trust that God's plans for you are greater than you can imagine. Embrace His redirection, knowing that He is working all things together for your good and His glory. When God says no, we are sometimes tempted to believe it's because He doesn't love us. But the truth is, His no is often because He loves us too much to give us less than His best.